If you don't tell me the name of the man who touched you, I will burn this entire city to the ground just to find his fingerprint." Silas Vane's voice did not crack, but it carried the weight of a tectonic shift, a low-frequency rumble that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the Vane estate. He stood in the center of the clinical, white-tiled infirmary, a room designed for emergency surgeries and silent recoveries, now transformed into a chamber of impending judgment. His shadow stretched across the floor like a dark stain, long and jagged under the harsh fluorescent lights that hummed with a nervous energy. Before him, huddled in a hospital bed that looked far too large for her fragile frame, was Clara. To the world, Clara was the director of St. Jude's orphanage, a woman whose soul was woven from threads of untainted kindness. To Silas, she was the only mirror in which he didn't look like a monster. But today, that mirror was shattered. Her face was a devastating map of human cruelty. A deep, purplish bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone. One eye was swollen shut, and her bottom lip was split in a jagged line that had only recently stopped bleeding. It was the vacant, haunted look in her remaining eye, the way the light seemed to have been extinguished, that made Silas's blood turn to liquid nitrogen. Silas Vane was a man the underworld called the architect of agony. He had spent 35 years navigating the city's shadows with cold logic and sharp edges. He was a creature of war. But Clara was his sanctuary. The one place where the gunpowder smell on his coat didn't matter. Now, someone had breached that sanctuary. The air in the room was thick with the cloying scent of antiseptic and the metallic tang of Silas's repressed fury. He reached out, his massive, scarred hand hovering inches from her face. His fingers, which could snap a man's windpipe without a second thought, trembled. He was terrified that even a featherlight touch would shatter what was left of her. Clara flinched. It was a small, instinctive movement, a recoil of the shoulders, but it felt like a serrated blade through Silas's heart. She had never flinched from him before. Not when he arrived in the dead of night, not when the city whispered of his brutality. Seeing her fear him now was the ultimate betrayal, not by her, but by the world that had forced her to learn the shape of fear. "Who did this to you?" Silas asked again, his voice dropping to a whisper more terrifying than any shout. Clara's voice was a ragged shadow. "It doesn't matter, Silas. Please, if you go after them, the cycle never ends. Just stay here. Don't leave me. If you leave, you become the architect again. Stay and be Silas." But Silas was already gone. The man who loved her was being pushed aside by the machine that conquered the 5 boroughs. He turned on his heel, his long black overcoat billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. Outside the infirmary, his lieutenants stood like gargoyles. Elias, his second-in-command and mentor for 2 decades, stepped forward, his head bowed. "The perimeter was breached at 2 a.m., boss," Elias reported, his voice steady but oddly lacking conviction. "They took her from the charity gala. No witnesses, no security footage. The servers were wiped. This was high-level, Silas. A professional ghost job." Silas stopped mid-stride. He scanned the faces of his elite circle. Victor, the tracker. Marcus, the enforcer. Tonight, they were too quiet. Their eyes darted to the floor. Their breathing was shallow. It was a silence of complicity. "Find me the driver," Silas commanded, his words clipped. "Bring me the guest list. Every billionaire, every waiter, every janitor. If a single person breathed the same air as her, I want to know the volume of their lungs. And Elias, I want the internal logs from our own security server. The raw data. As the night bled into the early hours, Silas became a vengeful god. He didn't go to the police. He was the law. He tore through the iron cellar, dismantling the Valetti and Romano networks with systematic cruelty. By 3 a.m., the rumor spread. The architect was tearing down the world to find the light. The first clue emerged at a private dock on the East River. Silas found the car meant to transport Clara. It was abandoned, the engine still warm, the interior smelling of serpent's breath, a bespoke fragrance worn only by the elite members of the council, the very group Silas protected. This wasn't a street hit. It was a move by the society he had built. On the floor mat, he found a crushed pearl earring. Clara never wore pearls. She found them ostentatious. Someone from a ballroom had been in this getaway vehicle. The predator wasn't outside the gates. It was someone he shared bread with. Silas returned to the estate at 4 a.m., his clothes damp with mist, his eyes burning with rage. He bypassed the technicians and ran the gate footage himself. He zoomed in on a black SUV leaving the grounds minutes before the alarm. The vehicle belonged to his own security detail, SUV 402. The digital timestamp had been sloppily altered, a 3-second loop. This was an inside job by someone with the highest clearance. Elias, Silas said, his voice echoing in the tech-filled room. Elias stepped in, his shadow falling over Silas's shoulder. Yes, boss? We've rounded up the Valetis. I did it for the vain name, Elias countered, his voice cracking. A boss cannot love a saint, Silas. I saved you from yourself. Then let the empire burn, Silas said. With a speed that defied his size, he grabbed Elias by the throat, pinning him against the wall so hard the monitors cracked. Because by dawn, there won't be a vain name left. You didn't save me, Elias. You just reminded me why I hate this world. And now, I'm going to show the council what happens when the architect stops building and starts tearing down. Silas didn't kill him. He wanted Elias to watch the world fall. He locked him in the infirmary wing, behind the glass, to watch the woman he had broken. As the clock ticked toward 5 a.m., Silas stood in his dark study. He looked at the guest list. Every man who had nodded when Elias proposed fixing his distraction was now a dead man walking. The city was about to wake up to a massacre. The architect had found his fingerprint. The city was screaming, but Silas Vane was silent. By 6 a.m., the purge of the Obsidian Club was nearly complete. Silas had moved through the high rises and underground bunkers like a scalpel, removing the council members who had signed Clara's shadow warrant. He was covered in the soot of explosions and the blood of mercenaries, but his heart remained a block of absolute zero. He had destroyed the men who touched her, yet the hollow ache in his chest remained. He returned to the Vane estate, not to the infirmary, but to the one place even Elias feared to enter, the ancestral vault. Buried deep beneath the marble floors of the manor, the vault was a graveyard of secrets. Silas bypassed the biometric locks, his heavy tactical boots echoing against the cold iron walls. He wasn't looking for gold or deeds. He was looking for the Black Ledger, the true record of every asset the Vane family had ever acquired. The air in the vault was stagnant, smelling of old paper and copper. Silas's flashlight cut through the gloom, landing on a shelf marked with a crimson wax seal. His breath hitched. It was the Saint Initiative. He opened the ledger, and the world began to tilt. The pages weren't filled with business transactions. They were filled with surveillance reports. Subject: Clara Thorne. Status: active. Purpose: emotional tether and moral conditioning of the Vane successor. Silas felt a physical blow to his sternum. He flipped the pages frantically. There were transcripts of her private conversations at the orphanage from 5 years ago. There were photos of her mother, the woman Silas was told had died in a random mugging, living comfortably in a Vane-owned villa in Tuscany. receiving monthly payments. The professional betrayal was absolute. Now, every memory he held sacred. The night they met in the rain-slicked chapel, her laughter that sounded like redemption, the way she had tended his wounds, was a scripted scene. Clara wasn't a saint who found a monster. She was a masterpiece created by Elias to control one. Silas collapsed against a stone pillar, the blue light of his tablet casting him in a ghostly hue. He needed to know if the hook was real. He pulled the raw, unedited backup from the St. Jude's chapel server from 3 years ago, the night of their first meeting. In the official version of his memory, she'd appeared like an angel when he was at his lowest. But on the grainy black and white footage, Silas saw the truth. He saw Clara standing behind the altar, adjusting a hidden earpiece. He saw her wait for a signal from a man in a black SUV outside. He saw her wipe a fake tear, practiced and perfect, before stepping into the light to save him. A jagged, broken laugh escaped Silas's throat. He had dismantled his empire and killed his kin for a woman who was a walking, breathing lie. The architect's cold logic returned, but it was poisoned. If the saint was a lie, then the only thing left in the world was the agony. He stormed back to the infirmary. The staff scattered like leaves in a storm as he kicked the door open. Clara was sitting by the window. She was the morning sun catching the silver scars on her face. Scars Silas had once thought were marks of her sacrifice. Now he wondered if they were just high-budget special effects. "Silas?" she asked, her voice filled with that melodic warmth that had been his only oxygen. "You've been to the vault, haven't you?" Silas didn't speak. He hurled the black ledger onto her lap. The heavy book hit her legs, and the silence that followed was louder than any explosion at the Obsidian Club. For a heartbeat, the mask stayed on. She looked confused, hurt, but then her shoulders dropped. The fragility in her posture evaporated. She closed the book with a slow, deliberate motion and looked up at him. Her eyes were no longer windows to a pure soul. They were the cold shutters of an elite operative. "I wondered if the great architect would ever think to check the foundation," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave, the sweetness replaced by a dry, cynical rasp. "Nah, everything," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with a primal fury. "The chapel, the tears for my father, the way you touched me after the gala. Was any of it real?" Clara stood up. The limp she'd had since the assault, the one that made Silas feel like a protective god, was gone. She stood straight, her height nearly matching his. "The conditioning was the plan, Silas," she said, stepping into his space. "Elias knew you were too volatile, too prone to independent thought. He needed to build a conscience into you so he could pull the strings of your guilt. I was that conscience. I was the leash that kept the architect from burning the world. And the assault?" Silas spat, grabbing her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin. "Did you let them beat you just to trigger my rage? Did you sacrifice your own face for the script?" Clara's expression flickered. A flash of genuine, raw pain crossed her eyes, but she suppressed it. "The gala wasn't part of the play. Elias realized I was starting to lose the script. He realized I was actually starting to care. He had me beaten to remind me who I really was. He wanted to use your rage to kill the council, yes. But he also wanted to punish me for my betrayal of the mission. So you're a double traitor, Silas growled. You betrayed the man who hired you, and you betrayed the man who loved you. There is no saint in this room, Clara. Only a serpent. He wanted to break her. He wanted to destroy the only thing he had ever loved, because it was the only thing that had ever truly defeated him. But as he looked into her eyes, he didn't see fear. He saw a reflection of his own hollowed-out soul. Kill me then, Silas, she challenged. Finish the job Elias started. Prove that the architect is the only thing left. La cause. But know this. Even if my beginning was a lie, the blood I shed for those children at the orphanage was real. I didn't stand in front of those mercenaries for Elias. I did it for the only thing in this city that isn't a lie. Before Silas could respond, the world outside the infirmary turned into a furnace. A series of coordinated explosions rocked the estate, shattering the reinforced glass. Elias hadn't just been gaslighting Silas. No, he had been preparing a final solution. Realizing Silas had found the ledger, Elias had called in the cleaners, international assassins meant to erase the Vane name forever. The manor was burning. The gaslighting was over. Now they were two apex predators trapped in a house of fire. We have to move, Clara shouted, reaching into the lining of her hospital gown and pulling out a small, flat-profile pistol she had hidden in the bed frame. Silas, look at me. Elias is headed for the offshore server. If he broadcasts the official narrative, he frames us both. He erases the truth. Silas looked at the woman who had lied to him for years. He looked at the gun in her hand and the blood on her face. He had every reason to leave her to the flames. If we survive this, Silas said, his voice cold as the grave, I'm going to make sure you regret ever walking into that chapel. But right now, the architect has someone to kill. The black SUV tore through the iron gates of the burning Vane estate, a sleek predator escaping a crumbling cage. Silas gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned, his knuckles white, while Clara sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the rising silhouette of Elias's helicopter against the horizon. And the silence between them was heavy, suffocating. The atmosphere of two soldiers who knew that after the battle, there might not be enough left of their souls to salvage a conversation. He's heading for the rig, Clara said, her voice devoid of its saintly warmth. It was the cold, analytical tone of an operative trained to dismantle systems. The offshore server is a decommissioned oil platform 12 miles out, and it's the only place with a direct satellite uplink, powerful enough to broadcast the encrypted files. If he hits send, he doesn't just clear his name, he frames you for the council's murder and turns the city into a police state under his control. Silas didn't look at her. How do you know about the rig, Clara? Even Julian didn't know its coordinates. Clara didn't flinch. Elias took me there during the second year of my training. He called it the altar of truth. He wanted me to understand that the world is built on narratives, not facts. He was preparing me for the day I would have to delete your life from the record. The hidden identity was fully shed. They reached the harbor where Silas's private speedboat sat waiting. A carbon fiber beast with twin turbine engines. As they jumped onto the deck, the morning sun finally broke through the city's smog, turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. The chase across the open water was a masterpiece of high-stakes tension. Silas pushed the engines to their limit, the hull slamming against the whitecaps with the force of a sledgehammer. Behind them, the skyscrapers where Silas had once played God looked like toys. He looked at Clara. She was checking the action on her weapon, her face a mask of lethal focus. "Why did you come back for me in the hallway?" Silas shouted over the roar of the turbines. "If your mission was to end the veins, you could have let the cleaners do the work. You could have walked away." Clara looked up, the wind whipping her hair. For a fleeting second, the operative vanished. "Because when I looked at you in the vault, I didn't see the architect. I saw the man who took a bullet for Leo. Elias can teach a person how to lie, Silas. He can teach a person how to kill. But he couldn't teach me how to ignore the first real thing I ever felt. I didn't come back for the vain name. I came back for the man who was brave enough to try and be good." As they approached the rig, the first major hurdle appeared. The platform was a rusted iron leviathan, but it wasn't empty. 3 Black Ops gunboats were circling the perimeter, their mounted machine guns turning toward Silas's boat. "He's called in the remaining council loyalists," Silas realized. "He's not just broadcasting, he's holding a summit. He's selling the city's soul to the global elite." Silas steered the boat into a sharp, banking turn as heavy fire erupted, stitching a line of white foam across the water. "I'm going to draw their fire," Silas roared. "There's a maintenance hatch on the south pylon. If you can get to the stabilizers, you can cut the power before the upload finishes." Clara nodded, her eyes locking onto his. "If I don't see you on the deck, Silas, know that the saint was the only part of me that was real." She dove into the freezing Atlantic, disappearing beneath the wake. Silas didn't let himself think. He turned the boat toward the nearest gunboat and activating his concealed defense systems. The battle for the rig was a chaotic nightmare. Silas boarded via the main docking crane, fighting through a gauntlet of elite mercenaries. Every floor he cleared brought him closer to the man who had authored his misery. He reached the server room just as a countdown flashed on a primary monitor. Global broadcast, 88%. Complete. Underneath was a window displaying the city. Elias had rigged demolition charges across the city, tied to the server's completion. If the data went out, the city's infrastructure would be wiped clean. "It's a scorched earth policy," a voice echoed. Elias stepped from the shadows of the server racks, holding a tablet that controlled the self-destruct sequence. He looked tired, but his eyes held a fanatical glint. "You see, Silas," Elias said, "the only way to fix a broken building is to clear the lot. I am going to give this city a clean slate, and I am going to use your hand to do it. Clara? She was the final piece of your education. She gave you a soul just so I could show you how much it hurts to have it crushed." The intense emotional confrontation was interrupted by a massive shudder that rocked the platform. Signal interrupted, 92%. Clara had reached the stabilizers. Elias's face contorted with rage. Silas lunged. The 2 men crashed into the server racks. A son fighting his creator, a victim fighting his gaslighter. It was a brutal, unpolished fight. Silas didn't use his gun. He wanted to feel the life leave Elias's body. He pinned Elias to the floor, his forearm crushing the older man's throat. "You wanted me to be a man of logic, Elias? Here's the logic. You lose everything. Now. You'll die too," Elias wheezed. "And your saint. You'll all be vapor. Just as Silas reached for the manual kill switch, a move that would vaporize the platform but stop the city's demolition, Clara burst in. She was soaked and bleeding, but her eyes were fierce. "Silas, no," she screamed. "The backup. We can still save the data. We can give the city the truth without burning it down." "There's no time," Silas roared. "The broadcast is at 96%. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran to the main terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She knew the back doors Elias hadn't told Silas about. "I can reroute the broadcast. Instead of the official lie, I'm sending the raw footage. I'm sending the Saint Initiative files. The world won't see a tragedy. They'll see the truth." Elias let out a primal scream of fury. Silas held him firm, watching Clara. In that moment, the redemption arc reached its peak. She was no longer a plant. She was the one cutting the cancer out of the world. Broadcast complete, 100%. Uploading raw data archive. Across the city, every newsroom and smartphone lit up with the truth. The gaslighting was over, but the rig's self-destruct, triggered by the unauthorized upload, began its final count. "We have to go," Silas yelled, grabbing Clara's hand. They ran for the docking bay as the platform began to buckle. Elias was left behind, watching his life's work be dismantled by the truth. Silas and Clara reached the speedboat just as the main pylon collapsed. A massive fireball erupted behind them, illuminating the dawn sky in a brilliant, terrifying orange. The architect and the saint had survived the fire, but the city and the law were waiting. The aftermath of the broadcast was not a celebratory parade. It was a silent, suffocating fallout. As the raw data of the Vane archive flooded every digital screen in the city, the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of decades of lies. Silas Vane and Clara Thorne sat on the deck of the idling speedboat, the wreckage of the offshore rig still smoldering behind them like a funeral pyre for their past lives. The transition from the harbor to the city center was a journey through a world in shock. By the time they reached the docks, the first waves of justice were already manifesting. Federal agents were raiding the penthouses of the council. The police, no longer under Vane's payroll, were making arrests in the light of day. But Silas knew that true moral justice required more than just the fall of his enemies. It required his own surrender. The high-stakes emotional tension reached its peak before the doors of the federal courthouse. Silas turned to Clara, the woman who had been his saint, his spy, and ultimately his savior. "If I walk in there, Clara, there's no going back," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The data proves my father's crimes, and it proves Elias's madness. But it also catalogs mine. I am the architect of agony. The world won't forget that." Clara stepped closer, near her hand, finding the lapel of his torn tactical vest. "The world might not forget, Silas, but the children at the orphanage will remember the man who stood in the hallway. You spent your life building structures of fear. Now you have to build a foundation of truth, and you start by answering for what you've done." Silas reached into his pocket and handed Clara his primary sidearm, a symbolic abdication of his throne. He walked into the courthouse with his hands raised, not as a defeated man, but as a man finally taking ownership of his soul. The trial that followed was the most high-profile event in the city's history. For months, Silas sat in a glass-walled prisoner's dock. He didn't hide behind lawyers. He didn't offer excuses. When he took the stand, he spoke with a clinical honesty that silenced the room. The redemption arc was solidified when young Leo was called to testify. Mr. Vane isn't the architect, Leo told the judge. He's the man who stayed. To me, Silas is a hero. The verdict: Silas was sentenced to 15 years in a federal facility. Clara was granted full immunity for her part in exposing the council. 10 years later, the return to the light. The gates of the federal penitentiary hummed as they slid open on a golden morning in 2036. Silas Vane stepped out, a small duffel bag over his shoulder. He was 60 years old now, his hair a shock of silver, his face etched with the deep, honorable lines of a man who had paid his debt. Waiting at the curb was a tall, broad-shouldered young man with a brilliant smile. It was Leo, now a law student. "Welcome home, Silas," Leo said, pulling the older man into a powerful embrace. "The city has missed you, but someone else has missed you more." They drove through a transformed city. The dark corners of the Vane era had been replaced by green spaces and community centers. They reached a quiet coastal house where the garden was a riot of lavender and white roses. Thus, sitting on the porch was Clara. She stood up as the car door opened. She was 50 now. Her beauty matured into a serene grace. Silas stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "Who did this to you?" Silas asked, his voice a soft echo of the night they first met. Clara smiled, a smile that finally reached her eyes. She walked down the steps and traced the silver hair at his temples. "The world did, Silas, but we survived it. And look what we built in its place." She led him to the edge of the cliff. Silas looked at his chosen family, Leo, Clara, and the countless lives saved because a Mafia boss decided to stop being an architect of pain. As the sun set, Silas Vane took Clara's hand. He wasn't a king, and he wasn't a prisoner. He was a man who had walked through the fire to find the morning. The architect had finally finished his masterpiece. It was the quiet, steady beat of two hearts at peace, and the knowledge that the dawn would always find them together in the light. Friends, the epic saga of Silas and Clara reaches its final destination here. This journey of a Mafia boss transforming from the architect of agony to the father of the morning taught us that no matter how dark a person's past may be, the path to redemption is always open, if you have the courage to face your own sins. How did you like this finale? Was Silas's sentence just? And did Clara's long wait touch your heart? Be sure to let us know in the comments which moment of this entire series was the most memorable for you. If you enjoyed this long-form cinematic drama, please like this video, share it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your emotions and feedback are the foundation of our next story. We will meet again next time with a new tale. Until then, remember, after every dark night, there is always a new dawn.